Welcome everyone. We're going to give it about 1 minute and then we'll get started. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Election 2020 in Review webinar hosted by the Department of Political Science at Colorado State University. My name is Cole Wise, and I have the privilege of serving as the Scholarship and Student Program Coordinator for the College of Liberal Arts here at Colorado State, as well as a proud CSU political science alum. Tonight, I am excited to introduce to you our wonderful faculty panel who will reflect on this past election. But before that, I want to remind you that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. This event is being recorded and will be made available on the Department of Political Science's YouTube channel. With that, I would now like to introduce our panel and moderator for this evening. Dr. Robert Duffy is a professor and chair in the Political Science Department. His courses include U.S. environmental policy and the politics of organized interest. His research has focused on a variety of environmental and energy issues, as well as the role of organized interest in the federal elections. His most recent book with the late Gary Briner is Integrating Climate Energy and Air Pollution Policy, published by MIT Press. Dr. Courtenay Daum is a professor in the Political Science Department, affiliate faculty in the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, and associate faculty in the Department of Ethnic Studies. Daum's research focuses on the interaction between law and society, including LGBTQ politics, intersectional and feminist legal theories, and organized interest mobilization and litigation in the courts. Dr. Kyle L. Saunders is professor of political science at Colorado State University. Saunders also serves as the NCAA faculty athletics representative for the institution. Professor Saunders' studies and interests include American politics, with particular emphases on political parties, political behavior, public opinion, elections, public policy, and research methodology. And finally, our moderator, Sam Houghteling, is the director of Straayer Center for Public Service Leadership at CSU. Prior to joining the Straayer Center at Colorado State University, Sam worked with the city of Fort Collins and was active with a number of community organizations and initiatives. Prior to moving to Colorado, Sam received his master's in public administration from the University of Kansas and served as director of a Massachusetts-based nonprofit. At this time, I will turn things over to Sam Houghteling, who will get the Election 2020 in Review webinar started.
Thank you so much, Cole, for that introduction. We're really excited for the conversation today, and thank you to all the participants who have joined us. We're going to get started, and so we're going to hear from our three esteemed panelists and faculty members in the Political Science Department, starting with Dr. Kyle Saunders, who is going to sort of lay out the national landscape by focusing on the presidential race, as well as races for the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Kyle, are you able to share your screen? Because I know you had some slides and you are on mute.
I am not able to share my screen.
So let's get you to share. Let's make it able for you to share your screen. If you can't, we will.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. And let's get those slides up. And we'll get going.
Okay, excellent.
All right, thanks, Kyle.
Everything is working. Good evening, everyone. I thought I would run through quickly kind of a scenario of where we are right now and what we know and what we don't know. So here's 8 minutes on the federal elections of 2020. I thought I'd start out this evening talking a little bit about why both parties, what both parties could take away from what we know so far about what's happened. And so let's start with the why the Democrats should be happy. Most importantly for the Democrats, a presidential win so far, defeating a polarizing, unpopular incumbent who was an anchor to some Republicans and despised by some Democrats. And I have this little parenthetical here that's pretty important. I think talking about why Trump seems to have lost is a very important thing to kind of go through and think about. And in the end, the strategy of playing to his base really just didn't work amidst a coronavirus pandemic and a severe recession. Democrats should also be happy about a gain of at least one Senate seat, maybe three. We'll talk about Georgia in just a second. Democrats should also be happy about making some gains down ballot at the state legislative level nationally, though not as much as anticipated. And that's something Professor Duffy will talk about in a little bit. Also note that Democrats should be happy because they've won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, which is a very important deal. The Republicans should be happy, on the other hand, because of really unexpected by both sides, and we'll talk about polling in just a little bit as well, unexpected gains in the US House, and that could end up being relatively close. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Republicans could also be happy about potentially maintaining the control of the Senate and securing divided government for at least until 2022. We'll talk about Georgia, as I said. That'll come in just a moment. And Republicans really did do better down ballot than they were expected to. And that's allowed them to keep control of some state legislatures that will control some redistricting for the next redistricting cycle. Okay, let's talk a little bit. Polarization. There is no doubt. In fact, I'll just start with this quote here. That's the third bullet point. We are two countries and neither of them is going to be conquered or disappear anytime soon. I tend to think that this election really just revealed the deep divisions in the American electorate, and they are there and they are going to continue. There's a lot of reasons for this, and we can talk about more in the Q&A, but really partisanship and partisan identity, and especially the phenomenon of negative partisanship, which is basically the anger with the other side, is strong and it's getting stronger. And when you combine that with trust and efficacy being so low, you get a result like this and circumstances like this. The presidential election itself looks like Biden's going to win the Electoral College if everything holds to as it is right now, 306 to 232. Biden currently leads the popular vote totals by 4.4 million votes, which is around 3%. That compares to Hillary Clinton's margins of 2.9 million and 2.2%. So Biden did win more. In that it's not a particularly close election compared to past elections, and I think that's one important point that we can talk more about as well. Oops, and I seem to have lost the ability to. There we go. Trump, compared to 2016, many of the phenomena that we've gotten from exit polls, it appears that Trump improved his margins with Black women, Black men, Latino women, Latino men, but lost ground with white men as well as young voters. These trends were very much more noticeable in states like Florida, as well as some down ballot races across the United States. And there's really lots of overlap between people's votes, and the phenomenon of ticket splitting really just didn't show its head very much, except in places like the main Senate race, which we can also talk about if you'd like. Excuse me, there we go. And I'll talk more deeply about polling toward the end, but most of the pundits who were depending on polls really had expected a larger Biden victory, and as well as Democratic gains in the Senate and the House. And that's the surprise about this election, if there's been one. And polling really wasn't accurate for both publicly available polls as well as the internal polls. And so both Democrats and Republicans have been surprised by all of this. And while it did take a while, we did finally get a call by the media on Saturday, but the process, as we will discuss, also has a long way to go yet. And Professor Daum will take the "why did it take so long" question. A little word about turnout. Early voting was huge. 2/3 of the votes this year were cast before Election Day. That's a brand new phenomenon. It's novel, and it's an excellent turnout. 161 million votes turns out to about a 66.8 national turnout rate compared to what we had in 1900, which was a 73.7% turnout. Colorado itself, top 5 performance, 77.1% turnout, which was quite high. The Senate, Republicans won seats in Maine, Iowa, and likely North Carolina, which hasn't been called yet. Democrats fought quite hard for those seats. Polling really missed on these, and even after spending a lot of money, it would appear that Democrats are not going to get those seats. That's going to leave the Senate at 50 Republican, 48 Democrat, counting North Carolina and Alaska, which have not been officially called yet. That means there's 2 runoff elections in Georgia that you've probably heard a lot about, which will be conducted on January 5th, and those will be very, very important to determine which party controls the governance inside the Senate, as well as whether or not Democrats will have unified government and control of the presidency, the Senate, and the House. And everybody's going to be focused on that. A little bit about the House. There are 24 seats not called yet, so there's a bit of uncertainty about this call. But if all the margins hold that are there right now, Democrats will keep the House at a much reduced margin from last time. They will have lost about 10 seats. That means the Democrats are going to have a little bit harder time doing what they wanted to do after this election, even if Democrats take both Senate seats in Georgia. It's just the closer the margins are in both chambers, the harder it is going to be for Democrats to accomplish their policy. And as well, there's going to be some challenges to leadership inside the Democratic caucus. Polling, a little note about that, and then I'll toss it over to my colleagues. This was the last plot I've seen about all the polls, and the dotted line is whether or not the margins were underestimated towards each party. It would appear, you can probably tell just by eyeballing this chart, that there's quite a bias for the Democratic Party and against the Republican Party prior to the election. And these data are going to be continually updated as you'd expect, but it does appear that there was a systematic bias in polling, and that was very much so at the national level, where we were expecting a Biden victory somewhere around 7 to 8 points. It looks like it's ended up at 3 points, as I said. It was much worse down ballot in House races, as well as some of the Senate races. The phenomenon, why is it so bad? Combined with the polling industry is just in a very bad place. Non-response, nobody picks up their phones, etc. And then the phenomenon of shy Trump voters. It just might be that the name Donald Trump is on the ballot and nobody tells you the truth. And so there was a lot of confusion about this, and you'll hear more about this in the postmortems to come as we look at the data more deeply. In Colorado, no real misses here. Most of the races ended up right where we expected. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Professor Duffy.
Thanks, Kyle. I don't have any nifty PowerPoints or anything like that, so I'm just going to rely on some old school methods here.
I'm trying to unshare my screen, sorry.
That's okay. I'll just keep talking. Colorado is pretty clearly a Democratic state these days, as evidenced by both voter registration numbers and election results. Democrats control both chambers of the state legislature, the governorship, and both U.S. Senate seats for the first time since 1936. So that's kind of a big deal. In this race, as Kyle pointed out, polls had it pretty much spot on. Biden ended up, well, as far as the current results show, Biden's up a little more than 13 points. Hickenlooper's up about 9, and I think that's right in line where the public polling had it. Kyle and I have done research on the state elections in the state dating back to 2004. And when we first started looking at this, we're looking at voter registration trends. Republicans outnumbered Democrats then by 180,000. Going into this election, the most recent numbers had Democrats outnumbering Republicans by 105,000. So you can kind of see the sea change that's taken place in Colorado just over this 16-year period. At the same time, unaffiliated voters are now the biggest bloc. It used to be that Republicans were the largest bloc, and then Democrats, and then unaffiliated voters in third. Unaffiliated voters are now the largest bloc in the state, and they've been voting Democratic. Kyle can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the numbers that I was able to sort of do in a rough calculation before this webinar was the Democratic candidates were picking up somewhere between 56 and 60% of the unaffiliated vote in this election. And if you're both outnumbered in terms of registered voters and you're losing the unaffiliated vote by that margin, it's not a good place to be in the state. So looking as well in terms of not just voter registration, but voting shifts over time, the shifts are really focused in the suburban counties around Denver and in Denver. Jefferson County, Adams County, Arapahoe County, they're growing counties, they're largely prosperous. In 2016, Clinton won those counties by about 200,000 votes. This year, Biden won them by double that amount. And that's roughly the amount of his margin statewide, 400,000 votes. I think it's 420 at the last count I looked at. So when you look statewide, Biden actually improved on Clinton's performance in 50 of the 64 counties in the state. So most of them. And then if you zero in even more and you look at the Colorado 6th congressional district, which is the Aurora area, that for a long time was represented by Republican Mike Kaufman. In 2014, Kaufman carried that district by 10 points. In 2016, a presidential election year, he won it by 9. In 2018, the Democratic candidate, Jason Crow, won it by 12. And in this election, he's winning by 17 percentage points right now. That's just a huge transformation in a relatively short period of time. So I think what you're seeing in Colorado really mirrors trends that you see nationally. There's this growing urban, suburban versus rural divide in Colorado, as well as there is nationwide, that white college-educated voters, people of color, younger voters, and folks living in the urban and suburban areas are trending Democratic, and those areas of the state tend to be growing in size. And Republicans seem to be strengthening their hold on white non-college voters, older folks, people living in rural areas, which are shrinking as a relative share of the state. So again, it's not a great formula looking forward, into the future when you're trying to figure out how to win and be competitive statewide. And one of the questions we can talk about later is to what extent the shifts we're seeing, especially along the Front Range here, in these last 4 years are a temporary reaction to Trump, or are they a more permanent shift in voters' policy preferences? We heard a lot of people talking, not just in Colorado, but other places, about how this was a repudiation of Trump and how people were just tired and exhausted after, scandal after scandal. So we'll have to see, whether this sort of lasts. So turning my attention quickly to statewide races, Democrats picked up 1 seat in the state Senate and now control that 20-15. The House remains unchanged with 1 incumbent from each party losing. Democrats currently have an advantage of 41-24 in the General Assembly. So again, Democrats have a so-called trifecta controlling both chambers of the state legislature and the governorship. This year, trying to game out what that means policy-wise is difficult because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and the main issue that's going to be confronting state government here and elsewhere is going to be the budget. And how do you make things work when you have had much less money coming in because so many folks are unemployed and the states is bringing in considerably less revenue. There's also, talking a little bit down ballot, just very briefly, there's some evidence that, again, in some counties, the Democratic trend has continued. So for example, Democrats now control all 3 seats on the Jefferson County and Larimer County Commission. Democrats picked up the DA positions in Larimer County and in Jefferson County. And I think Sam had said before the meeting that was the first time Democrats had controlled the DA position in Larimer County since 1936, which is the middle of the New Deal. So that's, again, a significant sort of change. Lastly, we'll talk about the ballot measures, and we could talk a little bit about that later on. But the ballot measures are kind of a confusing mix of things that happened here. On the one hand, voters chose essentially to increase taxes in passing Amendment B by repealing the Gallagher Amendment. Did the same thing with Proposition EE, which was a nicotine and tobacco tax increase, but at the same time voted to reduce taxes by passing Proposition 116, which lowered the income tax rate, and Proposition 117, which limited lawmakers' ability to increase certain fees. At the same time, there were so-called conservative wins on Proposition 76, which is that only citizens are eligible to vote. And there were progressive wins on Proposition 113, which was the national popular vote measure, and on Proposition 115, which was the measure that was seeking to ban abortion after 22 weeks, and that was defeated pretty handily at the polls. I've got more information about all these different propositions, but we can talk a little bit about that later on if people have questions or we want to dig into it a little more deeply. So I'll throw it over to Courtenay now.
Thanks, Bob. So I think one of the things that's really interesting right now is that we are learning more about how elections actually work than ever before. I mean, I think usually we vote and then that's the end of it. And then, the Electoral College votes are recorded. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that we're really starting to become aware of the fact that the way that federal elections are conducted in the US actually varies extensively from state to state, right? And so I just want to start briefly by just reminding everybody that the 50 states in the District of Columbia are the 51 places where electoral college votes come from. And all of those different places have their own rules for conducting elections. And so I think sometimes for those of you who are residents of Colorado, we take for granted that we have this fabulous mail-in voting system that makes voting really low cost and efficient for us, and that the state of Colorado is really adept at processing and accommodating all of that early voting. And it now seems pretty clear to us, right, that is a lot harder than it may seem at first glance as we look at other states really struggling with this. I think, what we have this election cycle is something that's really interesting, which was that it occurred in the context of a global pandemic, and a number of states really tried to be proactive about accommodating and meeting the needs of voters in the context of a global pandemic and tried to expand things like mail-in voting and early voting. We saw drive-in voting and curbside voting attempts in some places. We also saw some states increase the use of absentee ballots in lieu of actually trying to establish a formal mail-in voting system. But the result of all these changes is that a number of states were trying new things under different parameters than usually would be the case. And many of these states just didn't have the experience or the infrastructure to execute this successfully. I think the other piece, though, is that litigation started way in advance of the election around some of these new ways of conducting elections at the state level. And for people who've been following it, the state of Pennsylvania was in the courts quite a bit and had two cases go to the US Supreme Court prior to the election dealing with questions about Pennsylvania's new early voting and mail-in voting system. So I think in the context of all this, what I had wanted to say is yes, this is taking a long time, but the fact that it's taking a long time is not evidence that anything is going wrong or sideways. And I think one of the things that I keep telling my children when they ask me about, why is it taking so long, is I remind them, and I would like to remind everybody that vote counting is ongoing in states across the US. It's not just Pennsylvania and Georgia and North Carolina. Almost every state in the country is still counting votes. California is notoriously slow for counting their votes. And I checked right before we got on today, and only 89% of the vote in California has been counted so far. And California as a state will continue to receive and count late arriving mail ballots for a while. they're really flexible about that. And I think we don't get all hot and bothered about that because we take for granted that California is a blue state and it's just going to go to the Democrats. But that's the reality. Similarly, I went looking for a red state, and I was looking at Utah. And as of this evening, Utah has only counted 97% of the vote, which is pretty high and is comparable to most states. But Utah will continue to receive and count ballots as late as November 17th. So today is what, November 10th? So for another week in counties in Utah, ballots that have been postmarked by the election day can still be counted. And so this idea that there's something like nefarious going on in some of these states is just quite frankly inaccurate, right? Like, this is how elections happen. It takes a long time to count the votes. And in the context of, to Kyle's point, record turnout, combined with a variety of new mechanisms for conducting elections at the state and local level, is just making things slower than usual, or appear to be slower than usual. But I just want to reiterate that that's normal. That being said, obviously there's a lot of litigation going on, both the Republican Party at the national level, state and local Republican parties, individual Republican officials, and the Trump campaign have all initiated litigation challenging the way that the elections have been conducted, the way that votes have been counted, access for poll watchers from the Republican Party. So far, that's had no success. So right now, I think there are 0 for 6 in trying to advance litigation in the courts. That being said, litigation is ongoing. As of this evening, there were 2 new cases. A variety of state attorney generals petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to evaluate the legality of the Pennsylvania State Court's extension of the timeline for counting ballots postmarked by election day, but received up until the Friday after the election. So that's on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court for the 3rd time. What I would say about that is the vote difference in Pennsylvania right now. Biden's up by over 45,000 votes in Pennsylvania. The votes that arrived between election day and the Friday after the election day have been sequestered and counted separately, and all indications are that they are not 45,000 votes. So you're talking about a small number of votes that, even if the U.S. Supreme Court tomorrow said, yes, we're going to throw out those votes, or yes, we're going to allow state law to be enforced, blah, 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 I can answer questions about that. It still is not going to change the popular vote in the state of Pennsylvania. The Trump campaign filed a lawsuit in federal court today trying to delay the certification of the popular vote in the state of Pennsylvania. And I think that is hypothetically more interesting. If you want to talk about viability for a legal route, I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. But I think what I'd wanted to talk just briefly about is, the allegations of voter fraud. And I think, one of the things that the American public is really coming to understand about the legal system in the past couple of days is that, it is not enough to say something. You actually have to bring evidence of fraud to the courts. And so far, right, the attempts to advance claims of fraud have not been successful because they've not been verifiable. That doesn't mean that there won't be instances in which there are verifiable instances of fraud moving forward. That's hypothetically possible, but so far that has not come to fruition. But the other thing that I think people need to keep in mind is, even if there's evidence of fraud, when you look at the margins and vote margins in the states where litigation is ongoing. In Pennsylvania, Biden's up by over 45,000 votes. In Michigan, Biden's up by over 146,000 votes. Does that sound right, Kyle? In Minnesota, by over 200,000 votes. Arizona by over 15,000. Georgia now by over 11,000. Nevada by over 36,000. Like, evidence of fraud would have to be so significant, substantial, as to redistribute. We're now talking about tens to hundreds of thousands of votes. And that's just not very realistic. So I think, if we're going to see any viable litigation, it's going to be around efforts to contest the verifiability of the popular vote, and to try and get into some sort of sketchy stuff related to which slate of electors will be slated from individual states. And certainly that seems to be the push in Pennsylvania. The political push in Pennsylvania is to try and persuade the Pennsylvania state legislature that the vote was fraudulent, and that the popular vote favoring Biden is not legitimate, which means that Biden's electors shouldn't be slated, and that the Republican state legislature should pick an alternative slate of electors. But Pennsylvania also has a Democratic governor, and law requires that the Democratic governor has to sign off on the slate of electors. And I don't think the Democratic governor in Pennsylvania is going to sign off on a Republican slate of electors that is being advanced in lieu of the popular vote winner slate of electors, which would have been Joe Biden. So you can see how this could get really messy, but I'm not sure that it actually will legally get messy. It will just stay politically messy. And I'll leave it at that on that happy note.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you to Bob and Kyle as well for kind of giving us a glimpse into the national landscape as well as what we're seeing here in the state of Colorado. So we had a ton of fantastic questions come in prior to the conversation today. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function, and I'll collate those as they come in and try to pose those to the panelists. I did that already with the questions that came in via email. And so I'm going to start going through them. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time this evening to talk about all of them. There were a number of questions about the ballot initiatives in Colorado. And one of the questions was really interesting because it sort of suggested that direct democracy is kind of weird here. If you think about specifically the tax initiatives, we both potentially raised the nicotine tax as well as the payroll tax to pay for paid family leave. We got rid of the Gallagher Amendment, which is going to have major property tax ramifications across the state, as well as lowered the income tax. So who wants to take a swing at this first? Would anybody, Bob, would you like to take a swing at this first, and then we can go around? Yeah, let's start over here, and we can just talk about the ballot initiatives and then move on to the next topic.
Well, I'll take a swing at it, but I really don't have a good explanation for it. I mean, it's just odd, right? I mean, in 2018, at the same time the Democrats were winning statewide for the governorship and all the different statewide offices and making big gains in the state Senate and the General Assembly and winning ballots winning races down ballot. At the same time, the voters were rejecting efforts to, among other things, increase setbacks on oil and gas wells, which people said, well, that was something Democrats were in favor of. So how do you explain that? I think in one case, in that particular case, it was the argument about jobs being at risk. This year, trying to take them in turn. I mean, the repeal Gallagher Amendment, Amendment B, had pretty broad bipartisan support among both Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature. And it passed pretty easily, like 57, 58% of the vote. So that one, I guess you could argue, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of all the forest fires going on in the state burning to the ground, that the commercials with folks talking about the ramifications that Gallagher had for firefighters and local schools and other things really, was persuasive to people. The other measures, nobody likes their taxes being raised. And if you're promising to lower their income taxes, that's, hey, sign me up for that one, even though it might be $30 a year for me and considerably more for somebody who's wealthier than I am. It's just, I think there's a fiscal conservative streak among voters in the state, especially among the independent voters who may, like I said, not like the candidates Republicans are putting up for statewide office, but still don't want to go crazy in terms of spending on all sorts of things they disagree with, or policy measures that they just don't see as a high priority, which would take us to the reintroducing the wolves into the state measure that was probably the closest ballot measure of them all. And I think it squeaked by with a couple thousand votes. Voters may have just said, well, why are we deciding that? Why is that coming to us? So I don't know. Kyle and Courtney may have answers on that one.
I just was going to make sure we got a shout out to John Straayer, who would be making some sort of bad joke about the wolves being a question of wolves being on direct democracy, but I'll leave it at that.
Yes, well, I know John's watching, so.
Thank you both. Courtney, do you want to take a swing at this one, or should we head on to the next question?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. So we also had a number of questions about polarization, which has been top of mind since 2015, 2016, and probably only ramped up since then. And so, one of the questions is not necessarily about sort of what we're seeing in terms of polarization. It's more solutions oriented, and I appreciate that. And so Is there a path to sort of healing this sharp political divide in the next few years? / how do we, this is two questions that I'm merging. How can we just decrease levels of polarization? Is that something that policymakers, academics, community organizers, and people who care about democracy should be focused on? Or is that sort of something that we have to live with it now until we get through this moment? Kyle, why don't we pitch that to you, and then we share with the group.
I apologize for my dog barking in the background. I could spend an hour on this, and I will try to keep it to 2 or 3 minutes. When I tend to teach about this, I talk about it as not just partisan identity, but literally there are fewer and fewer forces that are uniting us, that are kind of, in science, the words are centrifugal and centripetal, right? Forces that spread us apart and forces that bring us together. And there's a lot of forces that are spreading us apart, whether that's things like social media, information, the speed of information, the type of information, misinformation, disinformation, et cetera, et cetera. But also the myriad institutions, and even all the way to the two-party system, whether that's its interaction with campaign finance, whether that's its interaction with all sorts of elite incentives with regard to polarization. And so it's both an elite phenomenon as well as a mass phenomenon. And in kind of the world of political science scholarship, it's viewed as an elite-driven phenomenon, because elites structure our choices, and elites structure the discourse, and elites give us a lot of the politics that we have. And then voters react, right? Voters react positively or negatively, or by often, and what we've seen in recent trends is what that's led to is a decline in trust in institutions, in each other, in a lot of different aspects that are basically tearing our social fabric apart. And so often I'm asked this question a lot, and the problem is that if you pull one lever and try to fix it, that it interacts with a lot of the other ones. And, one is campaign finance and free speech, for example, or, and there's tons of, it's a very, very complicated policy problem. And it's also a very complicated social problem that more often than not, I tend to kind of want to start with the idea of ways that we can increase trust in each other and in government, and try to find ways to unite us instead of divide us. And that's obviously also a very difficult in the face of all the social forces that we see. So, I'm not going to sit here and say I have some panacea or some idea of here's what we should do. But I do think it is the pressing problem of our time. And I do think, or one of the pressing problems of our time, that affects a lot of our ability to solve a lot of the other problems that we face. And unfortunately, elections like the one we've just gone through, and I think a figure like Donald Trump, as I said in the intro, is a figure who really did foment that polarization and probably did make it worse. It was pretty bad in 2016, by the way, but it has gotten a bit worse, and it's noticeable, it's palpable.
Thank you, Kyle. Courtney or Bob, do you have anything you want to add before we go to the next question?
I can add a little bit to that. And I'm speaking for myself here, that one of the things that's troubled me in recent days is these efforts to contest the election results or to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election results are not going to increase trust and are not going to decrease polarization. In the past, and I'm an old guy now, but I'm old enough to remember that, in contested elections in the past, leaders would set partisanship aside in favor of the greater good to sustain the legitimacy of belief in our institutions and in the democratic system. I'm thinking of Nixon in 1960, faced with complaints and concerns that election was stolen from him. After that, Al Gore could have done a whole bunch of different things after the Supreme Court to cast legitimacy on that, but he went to the White House and even participated in reading the Electoral College results in the Senate, when he was the losing guy. That it seems like quaint old times, where we are. So it's discouraging to me.
I would just follow up on what Bob said. Not only did Al Gore preside over the Electoral College, roll call, but requested that members of Congress who were Democrats who wanted to contest it in some of the states not do so, and did so on the floor of the Senate, and asked them to please table that and to just move forward and certify George W. Bush is the winner of the election. And I think, I will just add that for me, I think one of the hardest things, not even just as a political scientist, but just as a democratic citizen, small d democratic citizen, is that I'm really discouraged by the buildup to the election and the aftermath of the election, the just absolute attack on the integrity of the electoral system. And I think that the damage that does intersects with increased polarization in ways that we could see the ramifications of that for many elections to come. And I think that's just really hard for me to process personally.
Thank you, Courtney. A couple of questions. I know you talked about sort of our electoral systems, Courtney, but a few of the questions have sort of probed those a little bit deeper that are coming in right now. One is about, would the popular vote in the 21st century be a better way to elect a president? Why do we have 50 states with different systems? Wouldn't sort of one national election day, and then we wouldn't have to worry about all of the sort of the goo surrounding the concerns, legitimate or not, related to mail-in ballots? Courtney, what do you think, generally speaking, would there be a benefit to sort of rethinking our election systems, or is that not our role today?
Well, I think you touched on a number of different ways to reform the system, and I think there's pros and cons to them. I think, the really hard thing is what's challenging about this moment is it makes it really hard to have an open and honest conversation about what types of changes are desirable from a small d democratic standpoint. And I think, if we think about gerrymandering and the way that the creation of electoral districts has become so politicized, the actual conducting of the census has become so politicized, it's really hard to talk about electoral reform without running into concerns and questions about who wins and who loses. I do think that there's a few things, that we could certainly do. I mean, one of the things, and I should say elections are conducted differently at the state level, but there are federal policies and US codes dictating things like the Electoral College returns and things like that. And we could certainly imagine a system that would move towards creating some more continuity across the states, but we live in a federal system, and the Constitution makes pretty clear that states will have the authority to set up the rules governing their elections. And so a lot of reform would have to go into that, including hypothetically constitutional reform. I think the big issue we're dealing with right now, though, is the question about the Electoral College. And we've, Bob mentioned, we voted on Prop 113. It passed here in Colorado. It's passed in a number of other states, and moving, away from the Electoral College vote towards the popular vote. I think certainly in some ways that's more commensurate with our idea of one person, one vote. But obviously the Electoral College was created for a reason, and it was to make sure, right, that states were represented as states in national elections. And the result of that now, right, is that smaller states with smaller populations are disproportionately represented in the Electoral College over large states with large populations. But there's trade-off both ways. I will just say, and I know I have some of my students from my Polls 101 class here who've heard me say this a lot over the past few weeks. I think the one thing that we can do in the US, and that for me, this global pandemic election has been good for, is getting more creative and thinking about ways to make it easier for people to vote, because when you make it easier for people to vote, we will have higher voter turnout. I do not think that the higher voter turnout in this election is simply a reflection on how much people loved Biden and Trump or disliked Biden and Trump, but also interacts with the fact that it was a hell of a lot easier to vote this go around. That people could vote at home. And if we lower the cost of voting, it makes it easier for people to vote. And so I would just like to see us at a minimum focus on doing that moving forward.
Thank you, Kyle. Bob, you want to take Bob? Let's go to Kyle for you first, and then we'll go to Kyle.
I just had one quick thing to add to that. I think, going into this election, there was always been this assumption that increased turnout was good for Democrats. Well, I think there's some reason to think in this election that that's not necessarily true, that Republican turnout in a lot of parts of the country went sky high as well. And so, it's not necessarily the case that, I guess you could make a political argument that people on both sides of the aisle might come to see that making it easier to vote doesn't cut one way to the advantage of one party and the disadvantage of another. Now, obviously those decisions are made at the state level. And so, in some states, leaders still may see a reason to want to suppress the vote of particular groups and to continue to make it hard to vote. Okay. In other states, that may not be the case, but I think, Courtney mentioned this earlier as well. I think there's, Colorado knows how to run elections, and other states could learn a lot from what we've done, in this state in the last 10 years.
Really interesting too, because there's this argument that, like you said, that there's this idea that increased turnout will increase Democratic votes. But in 2014, the first year that we had mail-at-home ballots in Colorado, the Republicans retook the state legislature, and Senator Cory Gardner was elected. In fact, the Democracy and Polarization Lab at Stanford University just released a study a few months ago about universal mail-in ballots, looking at the states that have had it to sort of get a sense for, do numbers go up with one side or the other? And they found it was completely mixed. It was the mail-in ballots increased turnout for everyone. And so that's an argument to be made that it's better for election season or elections in general. Kyle, do you have anything you'd like to add to that? I know it's
just briefly. I just to riff a bit on what both my colleagues were saying, and again, apologies for my dog. Having lived through what happened in 2000, in what was a much tighter election, and Professor Daum's point about it was really only about 500 votes. And that's why it was and it wasn't even that hard of a challenge to change that many votes compared to what we're doing now. I think there might be the perception that change needs to occur. We've only had a couple of pieces of federal legislation that have really affected both registration and voting, whether that's the Motor Voter Act or the Help Americans Vote Act 2002, which was a consequence of 2000 election. And so, maybe this tells us that we need to do something. I tend to hope that, but Professor Daum is absolutely right about the coordination problems and the polarization that's going to probably keep that from not happening. So,
thank you, Kyle. So we had a couple of questions come in that are sort of linked, and so I'm going to mash them all together and try to do my best, and probably start with Kyle on this one, since it's they're related to Georgia. And so a number of folks have asked about the sort of efforts prior to the election to delegitimize mail-at-home ballots, as well as the current efforts to sort of suggest that certain results are due to fraud. And there are a number of questions that are sort of suggesting that this might be more of a political strategy, specifically as it relates to the Georgia special election, in an effort to encourage enthusiasm or basically raise enthusiasm with one side of the political aisle versus the other. Let's talk about those two questions together. What do you think, Kyle?
So I'd start with probably a news event that occurred today. Both Republican senators, Loeffler and Perdue, have come out and called for the resignation of the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia. And in a, I think probably a more cynical interpretation, I would look to that as both a strategy for delegitimizing a Democratic close win. It will likely be a relatively close election. If anything, we learned from kind of taking all three sets of results from Georgia, right? Biden ekes out a close, what appears to be a close win. In the presidential election, both Senate elections were relatively close. If you count up even the special election, the margins are very, very tight. And so it's probably going to be a very, very close election. Or both of the elections are going to be very close. That also said, it's a registration strategy, because Georgians are still allowed to register to vote until December 7th. So this is something of a mobilization strategy on the Republican part as well. And again, they're countering what has been a very, very successful Democratic registration and mobilization effort, spearheaded by Stacey Abrams, but many, many different actors on the ground there doing amazing work for the Democrats. And so it's going to be a real, every eye, every bit of resources, every bit of attention for the next couple of months is going to be focused there. And it's going to turn into another nationalized battle that is going to become more and more and more contentious. Both sides are going to try to attempt to mobilize their side in any way possible, because it's perceived as literally momentous and important that Democrats get both seats so that they can maintain unified control of government. But if Republicans just get one seat, they keep the Senate and are able to basically have a session of divided government. So it's going to be massively important, but the strategies and the cynicism and all of that is I think to be expected, but it's also probably just going to continue the polarizing and the polemic nature of all of this.
Thank you, Kyle. Courtenay, there's some questions that have just come in that I want to throw your way first. And it's about the court challenges that we're seeing right now. Is there any precedent that we should be aware of that would indicate that any of these court cases could delay either Joe Biden's first inauguration or Donald Trump's second inauguration?
Yeah, so that's pretty unlikely because we have the dates are pretty well specified. So like a lot of things can go wrong in like little small increments of time. But then there's sort of like these deadlines that are prescribed by federal law. After the Great Reconstruction election, we passed a piece of federal legislation that specifies a variety of different dates for when things have to occur. So like because every state does their elections differently, they all have different state certification deadlines and rules for determining how the different states will certify. But then after that occurs, it goes into this whole set of dates that are established by US code. So the first date is December 8th is like the safe harbor deadline. And that's like the date by which states have to have made a decision about which slate of electors they will put forward. Then 6 days later on December 14th, they have to actually convene the electors in their states to cast their electoral votes, which then have to be certified by the governor in each state and then delivered by December 23rd. And anyway, this is a very long way of saying all this leads up to Congress counting electoral votes as mandated by US law on January 6th. Now, a lot of things can go sideways in those interim periods, but those deadlines are pretty fixed. So like, I mean, could it hit the fan, and could Congress on January 6th be trying to decide among competing slates of electors for different states? That's hypothetically possible, but they still have to make a decision on that day. And so the reality is that I don't see the inauguration, the inauguration won't be delayed, just a lot of weird things could happen between now and then. And not to say that things couldn't get really politically contentious. I mean, I will say though, Pennsylvania, which has been the focus of so much litigation, you know, the head of the Pennsylvania State Senate and the head of the Pennsylvania State House, both of whom are Republicans, have both come forward on multiple occasions now and said that the Electoral College slate that is forwarded out of the state of Pennsylvania will reflect the popular vote in the state of Pennsylvania. And they've said that in light of encouragement by both President Trump and Lindsey Graham and others to not do that. So, I mean, hypothetically, could they not do that? Yes. And could that lead to a lot of mess? Yes, but I just don't know that that will happen. And even if it did happen, there's still these deadlines that should get us to the inauguration on time.
Thank you. I'm going to pitch one question to Bob, and then I have one question for the three of you as sort of a final hurrah. So a lot of the questions, Bob, that came in were predictive, which I know we said we wanted to steer sort of away from, but I think that they're predictive in an interesting way as they relate to policy. And specifically, the questions were about, you know, the questions that came in were about, so Joe Biden has won. What does that mean from a policy perspective as it relates to, there were 4 categories that actually came up quite a bit. So maybe pick one or talk about 2. So DACA, climate change, and let's go COVID, because those were sort of the big questions. And these were mostly from either current students or former students of ours. So it was about sort of imagining what a Biden administration might do in those spaces from a policy perspective.
Well, it's very different from what people were imagining a Biden administration would have been a week and a half ago, you know, when they were envisioning a fairly substantial Democratic majority in the House and a Democratic majority in the Senate. I think it needs to be toned down quite a bit. I think, you know, this is not an earth-shattering revelation, but I think presidents have a lot more ability to do certain things executively than they do legislatively. So I think you could expect to see, you know, you already see newspaper articles about some of the measures that President Biden would do via executive order in terms of repealing the Trump position on DACA. Is already announced setting up a task force to deal with COVID-19. So those are things that, again, are under more of a president's control than some other things. I mean, in terms of, you know, there's some administrative actions presidents could take on climate change, but to do other things, you'd need legislation, getting it through a Republican-controlled Senate or even a Democratic-controlled Senate, 51-49, something like that, would require some significant concessions and compromises and would look very different than something that might have happened with a 55-seat Democratic majority. So I think, you know, the Biden administration, incoming Biden administration, will have to figure out, you know, what battles they're going to fight and what they're going to do, and they've got to navigate intra-party politics in terms of promises that were made during the campaign and important parts of the coalition that helped elect them, you know, younger voters, African Americans in Georgia and in, you know, other Milwaukee, you know, Philadelphia, other sorts of locations like that where the Black vote was also important, and try to figure out, you know, how do you keep promises for those folks? Again, it's probably a scaled down agenda from where it would have been if Democrats had done better in the election in the Senate.
Thank you, Bob. So for our last question, I'm going to sort of merge a few questions that came in. You know, one of the questions that a number of folks sort of referred to is, you know, what are the lasting precedents of this election, as well as what surprised you the most? So whoever would like to go first, unmute yourself, and we will take it from there.
Well, I thought Courtney was reaching for the unmute, but I guess she was waiting for me. So, I mean, what surprised me the most was the pickups that Republicans made in the House of Representatives. I don't think anybody had that imagined. I mean, again, Kyle and I were probably following all the same people on Twitter and seeing all the same stories about Democratic and Republican internal polls in a lot of competitive House races showing Republican candidates doing really poorly. So you were looking at, you know, 5 to 10 Democratic pickups. Instead, you're looking at, you know, 10 Democratic losses in the House of Representatives. So I think that's what surprised me the most.
That probably would have been mine, but I'll take it a different direction. I think I'll take it to Maine and North Carolina Senate races. I'm still confused by Maine. I'll completely admit it as somebody who's a political elections junkie. I guess I don't want to offend anybody from Maine, but Maine seems to just be weird. And North Carolina was one of and probably is going to become the tipping point state moving forward in elections. Pennsylvania and North Carolina are going to be vitally important for both parties to fight for, but North Carolina is probably more gettable for Republicans. But both of those Senate races really surprised me. And especially, and again, that relates back to the polling question. And I don't want to take Professor Daum's, what might have been hers, but about her, I wanted to hear her roil against polling for a moment. But polling does seem to be obviously very, very broken. And figuring that out is going to be, if we care about polling moving forward and we want to get a temperature of where the public is on important issues of the day and candidate evaluations and those sorts of things, we need an effective polling industry. And I'm not sure we have it right now.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to comment on polling tonight. Anybody who knows me has heard enough about my thoughts on polling and gray wolves lately. But I will say, I think, somebody who studies women in politics extensively, a few of my takeaways have to do with women. I was surprised that white female voters stayed as loyal to Trump as they did, in spite of the fact that polling had suggested that would be one of the biggest losses for Trump. And that didn't prove to be as significant as it had sort of been projected in the polls. I think the other thing, though, that I'm still kind of processing is, after the 2016 election, it was such a slam on Secretary Clinton and how she had been a bad candidate and she had really sort of messed up and had, the loss of the blue wall was her fault. And I think, I'm reflecting a lot. I'm surprised at how close this was and how the 2020 election for me does not look so dissimilar from the 2016 election, and thinking about what that really means for what Secretary Clinton's campaign had been like. And I think, there had been this assumption that Biden was just going to blow it out of the water and there was going to be this huge blue wave. And the fact that, Biden is victorious and certainly has a sizable lead in the popular vote, but it really was tight in a lot of the same states where it had been tight between Trump and Clinton. And if things had just gone a little differently in 2016, this might have been, Trump may not have been elected, but just as somebody who studies gender, I'm really thinking about the consequences of how this will reframe how we think about Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, and how there was a lot of assumptions about her as a candidate that I think implicated gender questions that maybe were not actually fair in hindsight.
Thank you three for entertaining that mishmash of questions that our panelists, or excuse me, our participants and our guests sent in. Thank you all for that. Thank you three for joining us today. I'm going to turn this back over to my colleague Cole, who does a fantastic job for us in the Dean's Office in the College of Liberal Arts, to close us out. Cole, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, and thank you to all the panelists tonight. Thank you to all the attendees for joining us this evening. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be made available on the Department of Political Science's YouTube channel. We hope that you will join us again for the webinars from the College of Liberal Arts and Department of Political Science, and we want to wish you well going into the fall break. Take care and have a very good night.